Hello and welcome to the Church Nerd Podcast. This is Andrew. Before we begin, a quick update on the podcast itself. You may have noticed that the past few episodes have explored different types of storytelling, communicating what religion can mean for us. I spoke on this a little bit in my conversation with Drew during the last episode, but I'll say again that when I was growing the idea of the Church Nerd Podcast in my head, I imagined it could be many things, and these last episodes have been explorations into those directions. As the podcast has grown, so has its online footprint, especially on the website. So you may notice that there have been some pretty nice changes made and updates to it, and I hope to make larger changes to the options and the general layout of the thing in the weeks to come. So please visit the website often to see what comes of that work. I also ask that you take another look at the book list, a handy place on the site where I provide links to books and media that are mentioned on the show as well as other things. Things like Sacrilegious, a really great and nerdy church vendor. They make religious socks that are fantastic. I have several pair, and I figured you might want some too, so I put a link to their store. And lastly, the book list also has a list of the gear that I use. I often wonder what kind of equipment other creators are using, and so I figured I would provide a list for anyone interested, as well as links to those items. Finally, an update on the epistolary, the place where I muse and write things outside of the podcast. I usually blog or toy around with ideas for episodes to come or episodes that will never come. That content, as well as all of the member extras that were previously on the website, have moved to my new Patreon page. Managing memberships is difficult, it turns out, and so now that I've grown and learned, I realized it's better to hand over that work to true professionals. If you're able to support the podcast, I ask that you sign up on Patreon. Patrons of the show will get all that previous content that was available on the website for members. And I will have extra time because of it to make more exclusive content for those members to enjoy. And the best news is that it's cheaper. You can choose the amount of support you want to give each month, and everyone gets the same great content. Payments are done securely online. I never have access to your personal information, and you can choose to pay with credit, debit, or PayPal. Even if you want to simply leave a tip for your host, that is fine too. Simply go to thechurchnerd.com and click support, or find a link in the show notes. But now that we're done with our state of the podcast, on with the show. So, what's your favorite comfort food? When I was a little kid, it was mashed potatoes with hot dog cut up into it. By itself, it's actually kind of bland, but as a kid, I remember loving it. Sometimes when I'm sick or my family is out of town for the weekend, I'll make it just because. I may dress it up nowadays with a little bit of spice or a pat of or butter, an extra pinch of salt to give it some edge, or maybe char that hot dog up a little bit to just kick it up a notch. But I secretly love this odd little dish. But why do I wait until I'm alone to make this dish for myself? Why do I keep it so secret and so safe? Perhaps I'm a little ashamed of this seemingly awkward dish. Perhaps because I know it really isn't that tasty on its own. Maybe it's because I relate hot dogs and mashed potatoes to that special time and place in childhood that's completely your own, before you sprint into adolescence and the thought of what other people think of you just cripples everything around you. The time in my life when I ate mashed potatoes with hot dog is the same time when I had an old cigar box to keep my treasures in. Rocks I brought home from the playground, a cush ball I got from my grandfather, a Matchbox car, those little pocket things that kids keep and bring out every now and again to admire. That is where I keep my love for mashed potatoes and hot dog, in my box of treasures. So I was sitting at my desk a few months ago thinking about the podcast, searching for something to say, something to share. And it was late at night, and as is usually the case, I indulged in my favorite late-night snack, some ramen. As I was eating it, feeling a little guilty because ramen is typically thought of as something you leave behind in college, not to mention you really shouldn't eat a bowl of straight carbs right before going to bed. As I was justifying my meal to the part of me that knows better, I thought about the culture behind ramen, the generations of lifetimes that have shared their traditional noodle dishes. And I'm not Asian, I cannot claim that heritage, but as an honest lover of various Asian cuisines, I realized that I had taken this simple, childish love for a 25-cent dorm room pack of ramen and let it grow and shape me over the next 20 years. Once I'd finished college, I started shopping at Asian grocery stores. I began preparing meals for myself. I ate at any restaurant that touted a signature ramen or noodle bowl on their menu. From pho or pho to Vietnamese pork bun to spicy Korean ramen, it all warms my heart as well as my belly. And so ramen for me is the perfect late-night snack. It's warm, savory, filling. For others, it may be a bowl of cereal. For those with a sweet tooth, maybe it's a bowl of ice cream or a couple of Reese's peanut butter cups. So the question remains, is ramen spiritual? Well, for me, it is. Each time I make it, I think of it as a gift to be given. I anticipate the joy of the steamy broth, that warm slurp of the noodles, that smooth feel of polished wooden chopsticks between my fingers. And when I defeat my late-night hunger with this bowl of instant gratification, I am grateful of how thoughtful I was to give myself this gift. And when I prepare it for others, especially my wife, I take extra care. I ditch the microwave and cook it over the gas top. I usually include fresh-cut onions and other vegetables, proteins, a soft-boiled egg, other spices. More than anything, I want the broth to be perfect, not too concentrated, not too dilute. I want it to elevate the bowl. As anyone who fancies a serious bowl of pho will tell you, it's all about the broth. When I make it for others, I want it to be more than just a cheap noodle soup. I want it to have joy and love. I want it to express how I feel, and I want those feelings of appreciation to become a part of what they receive and eat. And no, before we continue, I am not some ridiculous, detailed ramen chef. I use the prepackaged stuff from the grocery store like most people. I don't get up at 5 a.m. to start a fish stock or to break down pork bones. Perhaps I will save that kind of dedication for the midlife crisis I'll have later on down the line. But anyway, getting back on topic, is ramen spiritual? I say that it is because it's that process, that intentionality behind it. Ramen has ritual, whether it's a quick midnight snack or a properly orchestrated meal. Each step in preparing the ramen is done with complete attention to where I am and to what I'm doing, savoring the sights and the smells. Of course, the same could be said for any favorite meal you prepare. And so I will. Making your favorite food takes on an intentional rhythm that takes us out of our day or our week at large and places us firmly in the one-to-one time scale of the cooking and the preparation. For every minute that it takes you to cook is a minute you are hopefully aware and mindful of yourself in your kitchen. Now, intentionality is a big part of why I think this is spiritual, why food and cooking and these activities can speak to us as people of faith. And so why is it so important that things are intentional? Why is intentionality important in, say, cooking or any activity that you plan on doing? Well, I can relate it to an experience that happened to me in 2008. I was a young adult, working just out of college. I had left one job and was going to start another. And I spent a summer with other young adults doing the Bishop's Mission Corps. It was a project back home where the bishop set aside a space, a cottage at our conference center for young adults to basically live for 40 days as monastics, as, monks or nuns. And so we had this co-ed group, and we lived in this cottage in our separate rooms, and we were instructed by these two priests that would come in. They would trade off week to week, and there was a brother of a Benedictine community nearby who would also come and instruct us. And what we did was we followed the rule of Benedict. And for those who don't know, Saint Benedict, who started the Benedictine monks and monastic orders that we think of, Cistercians and those groups, live under a rule of life, a set of rules that govern how they pray, how they conduct themselves, how they interact with each other within the house, and how the abbot or abbess conducts discipline. And so we had the rule of Benedict, and we followed those rules. And it suggested how we are to pray, how we are to keep holy silence, what kinds of foods we're supposed to eat, humble, simple, scant meals. Basically, if there was a rule in the rule of Benedict, we lived that way. And even though we weren't professed monastics, we weren't taking serious religious orders or religious vows, we lived that way. And so that meant waking up early and exercising our bodies, going for a run together. It meant eating simple meals that we prepared for the community. Everyone had a turn to cook for that day or that week. We did chores around the cottage. That meant cleaning each other's bathrooms, kind of tidying up the common spaces. It also meant doing some gardening and some landscaping in the area to serve the conference center we were staying at. It meant taking turns to do the grocery shopping, all of that stuff. We lived as a community, and all the work that we did was to be done prayerfully. The study that we did was done prayerfully. Even just making sure that we kept a tidy room, that was itself a prayer. And so that's what I meant by intentionality and intentional living. It was a great lesson I learned from this experience. It wasn't just, we're going to be quiet because that's what holy people do, or we're going to pray because that's what holy people do. We're going to study Scripture because that's what holy people do. Hollywood does a great job of painting this one specific type of monk or nun, and so you think of like a cloistered religious person living away in a isolated community. But if you look at monastics today, they are a wide spectrum. They could be people who are living and working every day in a community, but have a regular job out in the real world, or maybe say a job leaned towards a certain kind of specialty. This happens a lot with school teachers and hospital workers, nurses, things like that. Social workers, dietitians. Anyway, I wasn't full-on monastic, but, I kept to the rule of Benedict, as did my housemates. And it was an amazing, incredible experience. It taught me a lot about myself, and it made me stop and realize that when I made my bed every day, that isn't something I would normally do for myself. But I was expected to do it, and I was expected to keep a tidy room. And just doing that made me realize I'm doing this as an act of prayer. Or when I was, say, cleaning all the bathrooms in the house, and that was other people's bathrooms, including my own, scrubbing that little space behind the toilet, or making sure that the floors were mopped and cleaned. All of that was an active prayer with my hands, not just sitting at the side of my bed with my eyes closed and my hands pressed together. There are many different types of prayer, and so the workout that you do in the morning can be an act of prayer. The study that you do, whether it's reading a book, writing in a journal, all of those kinds of things, anything that you could do in a day can be a prayer if you do it with that intentionality, if you intend on doing it prayerfully, and especially if you're guided by a rule, whether it's the actual rule of Benedict or a different set of rules that was created by another mystic or monastic figure, or just a set of rules that you create for yourself, a rule of life. If you want to know more about that, there are tons of better examples and better suggestions that you can find online that I could offer you myself. But that whole aspect of intentional living really spoke to me. So when you're, say, cooking for friends or family, take time to really enjoy what you're doing. When you're chopping vegetables, do it as a prayer of love for the people who are going to receive this meal. We always say that the best food, whether it was from your grandmother or your father or your mother or all those childhood meals that we think of fondly, it's common to say that it wasn't so much the cooking that was special, it's that it was made with love, whether it was a pot roast or a pie. The reason that your grandmother's cooking tastes so good is because it was made with love. And it's that intention that goes into that. It's that giving of joy and peace and affection that goes into the chopping of the vegetables and the kneading of the dough and the cooking of the broth. All of those things aren't just culinary technique. It's emotional injection, emotional imparting. It's imbuing the affection you have for one another in the meal. And you're hoping that somehow mystically, magically, metaphysically carries over into the recipient who gratefully receives that food. Is it a guarantee? No. Someone may just be hungry and wolfs down their plate, and they're not thinking, oh, this is the most perfect bite that was made for me and crafted with love and care. They may just be hungry and are eating the fuel they need for their body. But again, as the cook, you're happy they're getting what they need, whether they're taking the time to intentionally receive that meal. Now, that's a whole other thing. Yes, you can also intentionally take the time to enjoy the food that is prepared for you by a friend or loved one or just the restaurant worker who's giving you order number 15. All of these things can be done intentionally. So as we think of terms that are so common today, like mindfulness and centering prayer and all of those buzzwords that can happen, still do actually mean something. Take the time to appreciate the food, whether it's a guilty pleasure comfort food like ramen, or it's a hours-long cooked chili. Whatever it is, take the time to enjoy the process of making, the process of eating, the process of receiving. Whatever you do, do it with a prayerful intentionality. The universe in a bowl. It is often said by chefs and writers that ramen is the universe in a bowl. It contains a balance of life from the land, the sea, the mountains, and the air, tied together into a single or a double broth. The flavored oil, the samplings of fatty pork or fresh onion or eggs, which are all up to the cook. All these additional things add to the clean noodles that make each bowl its own unique creation. And then there's the different broths, whether it's the labor-inducing simplicity and clarity of a Japanese clear chicken-based broth, or the salty seafood-based broth with bonito flakes and seaweed, or the cloudy, creamy pork bone broth. Each has a complexity to it. Each reaches you exactly where you are on any given day, and that's amazing. Perhaps I'm lucky. America is currently benefiting from a surge in ramen offerings. Restaurants are paying attention to the complexity of a food that has graduated far beyond the dorm room. I recently discovered Korean ramen, which is spicy by nature. But more than just bringing the heat, it is robust, creamy, and wholly satisfying. And so, maybe I am lucky that a food I've always loved has been embraced by the wider culture and treated seriously. I would never have learned as much as I have or been able to experience the food that I love if it were not for the hard work of cooks and chefs all around me. So ramen may not speak to you the way it does to me. So what is your comfort food? What tells the story of your experience? Think about it, consider it, and the next time you prepare it for yourself, give it a little extra attention. Be mindful of what you're eating. Okay, so in closing, I have to say, I mentioned that I was going to save all the ramen cooking and intensity for a midlife crisis. But in the course of preparing this episode, I had to do a lot of research into ramen itself. And so I stumbled upon the videos of Adam Lau. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's an Australian television host, a chef, and traveler. And his YouTube classes on Asian cuisine tell you exactly how to make the ramen egg perfect, or how to classify the different broths and make them in your own kitchen, simply and easily. He does a great job of making things simple to do. And so now I am rescinding my previous comment about my 5 a.m. midlife crisis, and perhaps I'll just call it a new hobby. Anyway, go check him out. I have a link to his YouTube channel in the show notes. And a quick shout out to Podington Bear, the composer who wrote Halter, the theme song for the show. Now, all of his stuff is available for Creative Commons usage, and there are albums and albums worth of stuff that he's put up online. And while I could have used his stuff anyway, I reached out to him directly, and he gave me full permission to use his song for the podcast. And I just wanted to say thank you for that quick response and for helping me in this way. I really appreciate it. If you have music that you want to put into one of your projects and you need some Creative Commons licensure, check out Podington Bear. I've linked to his page in the show notes. I want to thank you all for the support and listening of the podcast. If you would, please give me some feedback and tell me what style of show you've enjoyed. I'd like to create more of what you want to hear. Also, if there are new avenues that I need to explore, please reach out to me. All of my contact information is at thechurchnerd.com. Those are many good ways to reach out and be heard. Well, we've talked a lot about food today, so if I've made you hungry, I apologize. So maybe you should, treat yourself by getting a bowl of mashed potatoes and hot dog, some cereal, some ramen, some frozen peanut butter cups from the freezer. Whatever it is that gives you comfort, go and get you some. This has been the Church Nerd Podcast. God bless.